Anyone who subscribes to this channel, and if you don't subscribe, you should, come on now, knows that I post many videos on the prospect of a coming civil war. Are we headed toward another civil war? And what I want to talk about in this video and focus on is the character of that war should a full-blown civil war begin. I'm not going to talk about the military aspects of it. That's a separate video that I'm working on. But the character of the war and how it might differ from our last civil war, because that's the aspect of a coming civil war that scares me the most. That's what keeps me up at night. That's what makes me deeply concerned for this country and for its people. I've been warning on social media about the prospect of a civil war coming to this country for almost 4 years now. I've been saying 3 years, but it started right after Trump became president. So we're pushing 4 years now. I posted my first video on the topic on YouTube in March 2019, not March 2020, March 2019. That's 20 months ago, almost 2 years. When I posted that video, and I'll link to it here, I had seen a poll that about a third of the people in the country thought we might be heading toward another civil war. And I thought that was a pretty scary statistic, that a third of the people in the country, left and right, thought we were heading in this really bad direction. Civil wars are not pleasant experiences for a country and for its people. I just saw a poll the other day. The number's into the low 60s. I mean, we're pushing 2/3 of the population of this country now thinks, just under 2/3, that we're headed toward another civil war. And as a historian and somebody who's taught about American history and the American Civil War, I know that one of the reasons we ended up having a civil war, and there were many reasons, obviously the big one is slavery. But one of the other reasons, contributing factor to it, was more and more people came to believe we were headed toward a civil war over primarily the issue of slavery. I mean, you see people as early as the 1820s warning about it, and you see more of them in the 1830s, more in the 1840s, more in the 1850s. I mean, the 1860 election wasn't just about Democrats and Republicans and Lincoln and the other people running. There were many of them. But there was a whole question of secession and what the prospect of civil war would be if there was secession. That's why you had Democrats running as Democrats, Democrats running as Unionists, people who didn't want secession. And of course, what we ended up with was Fort Sumter and a full-blown civil war. If you look at most modern civil wars, say the American Civil War, the Russian Civil War after the Bolsheviks took power, the Spanish Civil War, late 1930s, and then the Chinese Civil War. The four modern civil wars, of which you can consider ours the first, all but the American Civil War were particularly bloody in a sense of treatment of each other's sides. If you were in one of those civil wars and you were in a battle and you were captured, there was a good chance you would be massacred. If you were captured and you were a high-ranking person, you and your entire family might be wiped out, exterminated, eliminated. And when the whites got close to the area where the Tsar and his family were, they were all killed. These were no quarter given, no quarter asked civil wars. Chinese Civil War was basically the same. The Spanish Civil War was the same. And at the end of those wars, the losing side, if you weren't just massacred, you were sent to camps for re-education, for labor, which happened all the time after the Spanish Civil War, Chinese Civil War, Russian Civil War. The American Civil War was different. Our Civil War was, don't mean this as a pun, but it was civil. You don't see that type of thing. There were massacres, especially when you had rebel troops capturing black troops who were former slaves. Fort Pillow Massacre comes to mind. You had very poor treatment of POWs. Andersonville comes to mind. Confederates with captured Union soldiers, although the Union camps were no picnic either for the Confederates. But on the whole, you don't see, massacres going on. When Vicksburg falls to Grant's army, the federal troops go in and they start chatting up their captured Confederates and, giving them some rations because the Confederates were starving. They're not rounded up and, shot in the back of the head and dumped into the Mississippi River. They signed a form saying they wouldn't take up arms again against the federal government, and they let them go. Lee's army, after surrendering to Grant at Appomattox, what happened to them? Were they, killed? No. Told them go home. You had a horse, mule, take it with you. Some of them even let them take their muskets and sidearms home. The Confederate officers, Lee's staff, his corps commanders, division commanders, were they, lined up and rounded up and executed? No. What happened to Lee? Ended up as a university president. Died in his bed. Even Jefferson Davis, who was imprisoned for a while, he ended up a free man. Died of, I think he caught a cold or something at some point when he was old and died. He wasn't wiped out. His family wasn't, liquidated. This is the stuff that happened in these other civil wars, but it didn't happen in the American Civil War. And why didn't it happen? As I've said many times in these videos, it didn't happen because other than slavery, which was a huge issue. I don't mean to underplay slavery and its importance. It was the issue. But beyond that, for the most part, the differences between Northerners and Southerners, wasn't that great. Yeah, they sounded a little differently, but some people in the North, people from New York sounded differently than people from Iowa or California. I mean, there were all kinds of, differences like that. But if you look at the two sides, they were white, they were Christians, they believed in Republican government, they believed in small government, they believed in representative government, they read the same scriptures, they read the same philosophers, they were all capitalists in that sense of their economic beliefs. They saw the same plays, they read the same books, they liked the same music, they read the same history, literature. All these things they had in common. Beyond slavery, there was a pretty strong consensus in the country. The two sides differed over slavery in questions of race to some extent. I mean, there were racists in the Union Army too. And not everybody in the Southern Army was a slaveholder. There were probably people there who didn't even like slavery. Especially if you were a poor white, who wants to compete with free labor, slaves? And that's why they weren't killing each other. When things got quiet, they would talk to each other. There are plenty of stories where the pickets from a Union Army and Confederate Army would actually meet, exchange coffee for tobacco, and talk to one another and do all kinds of stuff like that. You don't see that kind of stuff happening in the Spanish Civil War. Sometimes they catch one of the other guys, they just shoot him. But that's what made the American Civil War different. But if you look at the prospect of another Civil War today, what do you see? What you see is there is no consensus. You look at people on the left, call them the blues. You look at the people on the right, call them the reds. There is no consensus. There's no color consensus, racial consensus. They're not all Christian. They don't believe in the same philosophy. They don't believe in the same economics. They don't believe in Republican government. They don't believe in small government. They don't believe in representative democracy. They don't read the same literature. They don't like the same music. I mean, there's all these things that are different. There is no consensus. Whereas in 1860, other than slavery, you had a strong national consensus that existed. That's why we didn't kill each other when we had the opportunity in post-battle situations. That's why the Confederates generals weren't rounded up and liquidated. Instead, they had things named after them. And it's not just that racist Southerners put up these statues and all. Go to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The high tide of the Confederacy. The critical battles of the American Civil War. It's in the North. Right around that battlefield. What do you see? You see a lot of statues to Northerners. This general, this unit, that unit. But there are statues and memorials to Confederates. There are statues and memorials to the North Carolina troops, the Virginia troops. This is where they were. This is how far the North Carolinians got. This is how far the Georgians got. This is where they were. Here's where this brigade was from Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. That's what you see. There was this feeling, mutual feeling of respect, acceptance. If you've ever seen pictures of the reunions at Gettysburg, where you have, the Confederates there doing their rebel yell. I think the last one was like in the 1930s, before World War II. And, they got both guys from the two armies are, hanging out and living in tents and eating together and walking around the battlefield and reliving their experiences. You don't have that sense of hatred. I mean, you don't see, veterans organizations after World War II, the SS, Waffen SS veterans, going to reunions with Russian veterans from the Eastern Front. You don't see any of that. You see some, where you have Luftwaffe pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain, meeting their contemporaries from the RAF. There's some of that, and some of the, I've seen stuff from like the North African veterans getting together. But in the places where the fighting was desperate, the Eastern Front, you don't see that. You don't see veterans groups from, after 1930s from the Russian Revolution, veterans groups of Reds and Whites getting together and having celebrations, hanging out with one another, bringing their families together. That doesn't happen. The American Civil War was a uniquely civil war. But the reasons that it was civil no longer exist. And that's our problem. That's what we should really be worried about. We need to keep in mind that as civil as the American Civil War was, 700,000 people died in the country. It may not seem like a lot, but it's almost, not quite, half of all the people who died in American wars died in the American Civil War. When I was in graduate school, it was more than half. It's little less than half now, but not by much. Given the size of a population, if we had a war as bloody as our first Civil War, you could expect to see 7 million dead. I mean, we've never lost more than 500,000 in a war. You're talking 7 million. When we lose 5,000 in Iraq and Afghanistan, so we're talking 7 million potentially dead. And that's assuming the war is fought in as civil a fashion as the one from 1861, 1865 was fought. If it's not, and I don't think it will be, because there is no consensus, there are these vast differences between the two sides, it'll be a very bloody war. So maybe double the number, 14, 15 million. You might think that sounds crazy, but remember, World War II, Russia lost 24 million people in a confrontation with Nazi Germany and its allies. Why? Because there wasn't any kind of consensus between the two. They had very different concepts of, the future. So what they massacred each other. Germans treated Russian POWs horribly. Russians did the same thing. They treated their populations horribly. And when the Russians got into Germany, they treated the Germans the same way. At the end of World War II, the Allies moved 12 million Germans. These were ethnic Germans who were scattered in places like Russia and Romania and Hungary and Poland. And they were trying to move them, what today we would call ethnic cleansing, into Germany proper, what was left of it, after they hacked off a lot of the land in the East. Of those 12 million people who were on the road at the end of World War II, Germans, ethnic Germans, 2 million died. 2 million Germans just died getting moved around at the end of the war. So when you see things like this happen, you can get huge death tolls. And that's my big fear of another American Civil War. If things break down and we end up in a full-blown civil war, it's going to be horrible. You will see massacres on both sides. We'll see red troops capture blue troops after a battle. Liquidation. Blue captures red. Liquidation. I mean, we can get hints of that already. I turn on the news and I see somebody on the media saying, or Robert Reich a couple of weeks ago, even before the election, if Biden wins, we need to re-educate these people. We need a commission to look at, all this other stuff. You have people talking about setting up re-education camps for Trump supporters. I mean, you say these are fringe people, but they're out there. Joe Biden's saying, oh, we don't see each other as enemies. We're all Americans. That's fine, Joe. But I mean, the people in your own party, the people in the media aren't saying these things. They want blood. They want revenge. They want all the Trump people going to jail. I mean, there are websites. I've seen them. I've been on them. You can find the names and addresses of Trump supporters. It's really unnerving if you're a conservative to go to these websites and say, oh, there I am. My house number, my name, I gave to Trump. So the next time there's a riot in my area, and we had them this summer, not more than 5 minutes from where I live, they know where to go. Is this supposed to make me think, oh, maybe I should, put up a BLM banner and register as a Democrat instead of a Republican? No. I'm shopping around for a new gun. I want more than one. I want more ammunition. I mean, that's what it's making me think of doing. I mean, I wasn't planning to buy another gun, but when I started seeing this stuff going on, and I see these whack jobs in the media saying, we got to find out who these people are. They got to pay a price for supporting this guy and what do you call it? Putting this guy in power, trying to keep him in power. I understand these things. I can see which way it's headed. So, Joe, before you lecture me, lecture your own people. Try to get them in line and tell them that we're all Americans. Because basically, I don't think that we are anymore. We have different concepts of what it means to be an American, and never the twain shall meet. That's what I think. Let me know what you think in a comment. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Not give it a thumbs down. That's fine. It's still a free country as far as I'm concerned. Hit the notification button so you know when I post new videos. Share the video with your friends. Subscribe to the channel if you can. And until the next time, keep fighting.